Welcome to this episode of HuntStand's Deer Dirt. Today I want to talk about how deer relate to specific terrain features. If you go back to episode 1 of season 2, I got into the topic of e-scouting, how you can use the HuntStand app or the website, the aerial photo backgrounds, the topo map layers, and pick good stand locations in your hunting area. You know, it's nice obviously to be able to do that in advance of the season without having to leave a bunch of scent at a time of the year when maybe it's really hard to learn anything anyway. You know, the summertime is a really tough time to scout. But today I want to take that concept just a step further. I want to go into more detail on the specifics of each type of terrain feature. So I'll show you how to find those on the HuntStand app, and I'll talk a little bit about how deer relate to those. And then in some cases, I've got aerial footage that shows those either on this farm or other places that I've hunted. So let me get my list out. I had to make a list. The first feature that I want to talk about is a bluff edge. And these are easy to find because the topo lines stack up and they get really close together on the topo map. I like the map box layer overlay when I'm on HuntStand. That one, the topo lines make the most sense to me. There's other ones you can look at that have different graduations between the lines. I think there's 3 different topo map versions. But anyway, like I said, I like map box. So that's the one I'm going to be using here. So anytime you see topo lines that are really close together, what that means is that it's dropping off quickly. So if you have a steep bluff, the deer don't usually travel along those very well. They usually go around those, especially if they're really steep. They don't like to go up and down them. They don't even like to walk along them. That's a super easy spot to hunt if you're willing to do what the deer aren't, and that is climb the bluff. Because if you can set up where the wind is blowing from the trail up on top of the bluff out over, your scent is going to be carried away from the deer. They're never going to pick you up while you're on stand. And like I said, they don't like to approach from that super steep downhill side. So if you can come up that way and get into your stand, the entry and exit is bulletproof, and then your scent on stand is bulletproof. This is a great funnel. So anytime you can find a bluff edge, definitely worth hunting. Now let's talk about creek crossings. And these are really good stand locations. They're always good funnels, especially during the rut, but almost any time of the year. If you've got a creek between where the deer bed and where they feed, they're going to use the crossings, whether it's early season or late season. And during the rut, the ideal creek crossing is one that lies between 2 areas where does bed. And the bucks are, as they cruise back and forth between those doe bedding areas, they're going to naturally use that crossing. So it's just another really good funnel. They're harder to pick on a topo map than some other terrain features. So you have to look for the water courses. Anytime you see an S bend or any kind of a bend, you can expect that as the water goes around that outside bend, it erodes that bank and causes it to be higher and steeper than other parts along the creek. So the perfect place for a crossing is right in the middle of an S bend. So you got one bend going one way, one bend going the other way, and the spot in between. The terrain is very much more, so it's more gradual, I guess is the word I'm looking for. Those are pretty easy to find. Like I said, they're easy to find with aerial photos because you can see the creeks. They're easy to find with topo maps. The S-bends are. But the actual shape of the water course is what gives away where those crossings are going to be. They're really a little bit challenging to hunt. You know where they're going to cross at, but the biggest challenge is figuring out how to get a safe wind down in these locations. Normally you've got swirling whenever you're down in a valley. And if you're hunting where the wind is blowing either straight up or straight down the creek, which is the only way you're going to be able to hunt that without swirling, then you got to make sure you're on the farthest downwind crossing, or you're going to have deer getting downwind of you on other crossings further up or down the creek on the downwind side. So keep that in mind. They're pretty easy to find, but they can be fairly challenging to hunt. The entry and exit is super easy because you can walk right in the creek. I've done it many times. It works really well. The deer don't know you're there. Let's see what we got. A ditch crossing. Ditches are fairly easy to find also on the topo maps. Anytime you see where the topo lines make a sharp bend and they'll stack up, there'll be multiple topo lines making the sharp bend. That's a draw. And those are areas where you're like a hollow or whatever you want to call it, where there's a valley going up a slope, up onto a ridge. A lot of times in most parts of the country, there's going to be a ditch at the bottom of that draw. All the water gathers there as it comes off the fields on top, or just as it comes, if there's not fields on top, as it comes off the hillside, it funnels down into that draw. And in the process of doing that, it makes a ditch. So the deer don't like crossing these ditches. A lot of times they're steep and deep. It's not an easy path of least resistance to the deer. They'll go around them. They'll go around ditches. So any place there's a gradual bank where they can cross, that's going to make a good funnel. And ideally, again, you're looking at during the rut, you'd love for these ditches to be between two spots where does bed. So that would be the perfect setup. And they're pretty easy to hunt as well, because you can come up from below, you can sneak right up the bottom of the ditch. You might have to go in ahead of time with a chainsaw and clean it out so that you can sneak through there a lot quicker and more quietly when you go back to hunt it. You just keep going up until you hit the highest crossing where the wind is going to be the most steady. So it depends on how steep the slope is. If it's pretty steep, you're going to be high above the deer that are on the downwind side. So that's going to give you some advantage there. If you get up into the tree 20 plus feet, now your scent is going to be carrying out over the deer that are downwind of you. So you want to go towards the top of the ditch. Coming in from the bottom, use the ditch for your entry and exit, and go towards the top. The closer to the top, the better. In some cases, you can go all the way to the top where the deer go around the ditch. Again, fairly easy to find and fairly easy to hunt. Okay, saddles. Anytime you see circles or locations on the topo lines where the elevation lines form separate parts. It's kind of hard to describe that. It's easier just to show it to you here, but you can see what I'm talking about. You've got the same elevation on this line, the same elevation on this line. In between them, it's lower. So that's a saddle. And the deer like to use these anytime they cross a ridge line. It's really the path of least resistance, but it's also the keeps them off the skyline, so they're not as visible. That makes them feel safer. A lot of times when they're crossing ridges, you'll find that they're crossing in the saddles, and they can be fairly subtle. They can be a little bit harder to find when you're scouting because of the fact that they may not be so obvious when it's just a few feet of elevation change, and it's harder to see when you're looking at the aerial footage, the aerial video. But when you look at the topo map, it's pretty obvious. You've got your circles, or your opposing, the two little U shapes face away from each other, and then the ground in between is lower. That's a saddle. The saddles can be a little bit tricky to hunt because you don't know exactly how the deer are going to go through them. If they're narrow, it's no big deal, but if they're broad, especially with the bow, it can be a little bit tricky. So these generally require some experience. Find the most conservative downwind fringe of the saddle, put your time in there, and then learn as you go, because probably the deer are going to favor one side or the other as they're going up through there, but you're not going to know that until you actually sit there and learn it. Okay, benches. Benches are pretty rare, but when you find them, they're really good. Deer bed on benches. During the rut, they travel benches very heavily. They're pretty awesome spots, really, but they're not very common. They show up on the topo maps as a spot where the lines are close together and then they spread, and then they go closer together again. So it's steep, fairly flat when the lines spread, and then steep again. That's the bench. In some cases, it can be as simple as just an old logging road. They may not even show up on the topo map, unfortunately. That one might take a little bit of on-the-ground scouting when you're finding ones that are, you know, like I said, like an old logging road that runs along the side of the slope. But anytime you see a bench on the topo map, you should plan on hunting that spot. When you find them, if you can figure out how to hunt it effectively, it may be the most productive terrain feature that you'll ever hunt. Okay, now I want to talk about a bedding point. And I've got a bunch of them on this farm. Anytime you have a ridge, if you've got secondary ridges that extend out to the side from that primary ridge and form almost like a point, I call them points, where they just extend and then they just drop off. You know, it's not a continuous ridge, it's just a point that sticks out, like I said, like a secondary ridge sticking out away from a primary ridge. These are really highly used bedding areas. They really like to bed out on the end of those points because they can see everything below them that's downwind, and they can smell everything behind them that's on the upwind side. So they just vary, you know, where they're at on the point, you know, which side of the point they bed on, depending on the wind direction. So they always have that safe wind at their back. They can always see what's going on below. Okay, so this is not a terrain feature. I guess it is in the strictest sense. Anytime you're hunting valleys or bottoms that have, say, a bigger river system like what we have around here. The Mississippi River is not too far from my farm. There's all kinds of waterways in there, little ponds, lakes, sloughs. Anytime you've got high ground between two areas of water, that's going to be a funnel. And you know, during most of the year, the deer may not use it that much because, you know, they've got probably fairly compact, you know, bedding to feeding patterns that they follow. But boy, when you get into the rut, those spots turn into highways. So finding those, and they're easy to find because, you know, you can see the bodies of water really easily, and obviously you can see the land in between. And you might have to look at the aerial photo versus the topo map to see these most easily. But any dry ground or high ground between two bodies of water, that's always going to be a great spot during the rut. I'm sure we could go on about some of these features. You know, I've hunted almost all of them, and I've got stories to tell, and it'd be fun to tell those stories. But in the sake of getting this episode moving and getting you back to whatever it is you got to do today, I'm going to hang it up right here. Well, I appreciate you joining me. I'll see you back here again soon for the next episode of HuntStand's Deer Dirt.